The last sunrise. Prologue. The world stood on the edge of an abyss that the human eye could barely comprehend. The days were getting shorter, and the sky seemed to have lost its warm light, changing into a tent of cloudy shadows. The winds brought rumors and news that intertwined, broken alliances, open fronts, cities that fell under the burden of their own conflicts. People lived their days with fear, but especially with a hidden feeling deeper than the fear of death. The fear of being forgotten, of leaving no trace behind, no echo of their existence. And this ended world, an old man named Abraham rose like a fragile light, bearer of the ancient writings of the prophecies. In an isolated hut, he read Ezekiel and the Revelation, and the ancient words rang like bells in the souls of those who listened to him. His words they were not just warnings, but maps to understanding the end. Each fragment of scripture became a clue to what was to come, a bridge between the tumultuous past and a future that was preparing to be written in eternal light. As Abraham spoke of the final wars and the signs of the heavens, a subtle change began to be felt in the air. Was not just fear, but anticipation, like a trembling that announces the storm before the clouds appear. People felt that history was concentrated in a unique moment, that every choice, every step and every thought mattered in an equation greater than all of humanity. And in the midst of this chaos, hope shone timidly, the promise of a sunrise unlike any other, the beginning of a world in which light and peace would no longer be just a dream. The prologue to The Last Sunrise is not just the beginning of a story about the end of the world, but also about rebirth.It is the story of people learning to look beyond the shadows, to find meaning in the disaster, and to wait with faith for the light that will transform everything. And this waiting, time seems to dilate, and the universe itself seems to breathe, setting the stage for the most amazing sunrise the world has ever seen, the sunrise that knows no end. Chapter 1. The Cloudy Sky. That morning seemed like any other at first, but the sky would not decide between day and night. The clouds lay heavy, mixed with an orange haze, and the sun, when it tried to rise, seemed like a sick eye, covered with eyelids of smoke. There was no rain, but the humidity in the air stuck to your clothes. There was no storm, but you felt a pressure in your stomach, as if the earth breathed differently. My village, although small, had the cafe on the corner of the main road, the place where news was more important than coffee. For years, the televisions hung on the walls had been playing non-stop, but now their sound seemed sharper, more hurried. There were no more reports about weather, sports, or domestic politics. Everything was about fronts, troop movements, and decisive measures. On the screen, colored maps showed red lines approaching borders. Reporters talked about alliances that had collapsed overnight. Decades-old military pacts broken by short, cold statements. Countries that had been partners until yesterday were withdrawing their ambassadors and blocking trade. Other nations, thousands of kilometers apart, were hastily signing new treaties, out of fear or interest. The cafe tables, people were no longer discussing crops, but supplies. "Have you put away the canned goods?" someone asked. "Diesel is getting more expensive," another replied. Some hid their concern in jokes, others never tired of smiling. The news came in waves, and each wave brought something colder than the previous one. From a corner, old Abraham watched the screen without blinking. It wasn't the first time I'd seen him like this. I'd known him since childhood, a quiet man, with an old Bible always at hand. For a few weeks, I'd heard him mumbling verses while drinking his tea. He didn't speak very often, but when he did, he had a way of saying things as if he'd already read them somewhere, a long time ago. "It started," he said slowly, without looking at anyone in particular. Some turned their heads towards him, others pretended not to hear. No one wanted to be the first to ask, "What started?" Outside, a short, cold wind could be heard, the kind we rarely felt at the beginning of spring. A faint sound followed, like distant thunder, but there were no storm clouds on the horizon. Tea was enough to make us all fall silent for a few seconds. Then the television interrupted the broadcast with a special alert. An important port had been attacked during the night. The images were blurry, but you could clearly see the silhouettes of burning ships, and the sky above them burned red, reflected in the water. The reporter said in a low voice that two great powers had already mobilized their forces, and a third was threatening unprecedented retaliatory measures. Next to me, a man with hands cracked from work murmured, "This is the spark." Old Abraham then got up and went out into the street. I followed him out of a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. The air outside was thick, almost unbreathable. On the horizon, above the forests, a thin line of smoke could be seen, slowly drifting north. "See," he said, pointing with his finger, "it's not just their war. The whole sky knows." I didn't answer. I didn't know what to answer. He was right in a way that was hard to explain. You felt that it wasn't just politics, it wasn't just economics. It was something else, something that hung over the world like an invisible bell. And the following days, everything accelerated. Military planes flew over the village more often, so low that the windows vibrated. Long trains passed by at night, with covered carriages. The news talked about tactical movements, but people saw something else, the preparation of a storm. On the internet, the theories were mixed. Some said that it was just a temporary crisis, others that it was the beginning of the end. Popular Channel published images every day from places where the sky turned red at sunset, putting them next to texts from old books. The comments were full of arguments. Some accused religious alarmism, others swore that everything was written a long time ago. One evening, the electricity went out in the entire village. The lights of the distant cities gradually went out, until everything was immersed in pure darkness. Only the moon, filtered through the thin smoke, dimly illuminated the houses. Then I saw Abraham sitting on the bench, with the Bible in his lap, and he said, "Shadows gather. And when they gather, they don't disperse on their own." His words stuck in my mind, because that night I dreamed of an endless field full of soldiers. They weren't wearing modern uniforms, but neither were they wearing old armor. They were mixed, coming from all times and places, and they were all walking towards the same point in the distance, where the sky burned white. In the morning, the wind had brought a heavy smell of burnt metal. No one knew where it came from. The news said nothing about it, only about new negotiations between states that, a month before, didn't even talk to each other. It was clear that the world was dividing into camps and that there was no room in the middle. As the days passed, people began to buy more than they needed. The village store was running out of flour, oil, and salt. The owner smiled bitterly. "There's no famine yet, but people are, I'm preparing." As if it were one evening, a military truck pulled up on the main road. The soldiers said nothing, just looked around and moved on. But their presence left a void in everyone's chest. On the radio, a military analyst was saying that the balance of global power is at its most unstable point in the last 2 centuries. But for us, it wasn't about scales or theories. It was about that background sensation, like a constant hum, as if the earth itself was waiting for something. Old Abraham began to disappear from the village for days. No one knew where he was going. When he returned, his gaze was heavier and he would say short things, "They've crossed the border," or "It's not long now." No one asked him who or what. We all understood that the answer would not reassure us. One morning, just a few hours after sunrise, the sky suddenly darkened, as if at a eclipse. It wasn't an eclipse. We all knew that it was a huge black cloud, rising somewhere very far away. The television said it had been an industrial explosion in a country overseas, but the images they showed were fragmented, as if someone didn't want us to see everything. That evening, there were no more jokes in the cafe. Only whispers. A young man asked, "If everything goes to hell, where do we run?" No one answered him. Avram, instead, said, "It's not about where you run, it's about who finds you." Then I knew that the cloudy morning sky was not just a coincidence. It was a sign. Maybe not one that everyone understood, but one that the earth, the sky, and those with open eyes felt the same. Something huge was approaching, and when it arrived, nothing could be the same. Chapter 2. Old Abraham's Words. Old Abraham was not from our village to begin with. He had come years ago, one rainy autumn, bringing with him only an old suitcase, a walnut cane, and a Bible with worn covers. No one knew exactly where he came from. Some said that he had been a history teacher in the city, others that he had worked on construction sites in the Middle East. But no one could confirm anything, because Abraham never talked about his past. You would see him first thing in the morning, walking slowly along the dusty road, his cane rhythmically tapping the gravel. He would often stop to look at the sky, as if everything he needed to know were written up there. He had hair as white as the foam of the sea in winter and a short but neat beard. However, his eyes were the part that attracted attention. They were not tired, old eyes, but clear and penetrating, as if they could see more than the rest of the people. The first time I heard the words, "otherwise," was on a quiet afternoon in the cafe. Outside, a warm wind was blowing, but inside, the television was blaring about a new, strategic mobilization on the borders of a distant country. People nodded, commented nervously or sarcastically, until Abraham, without looking up from his cup of tea, said quietly, "The time has come for Gog of the land of Magog." The silence fell immediately. These names were not those of any modern politician. They did not appear on the maps I saw on the news. They seemed taken from an old story, and yet he spoke them with an unsettling certainty. An older man, who had worked at the port for years, snorted, "Gog, Magog. These are from Grandma's fairy tales." Abraham looked up, and there was no anger in his eyes, but a sharp silence. "They are not fairy tales. They are written in Ezekiel, long before we were born, and it is happening now." He took the Bible out of his old bag, with brown covers worn at the corners. He opened it to a place he knew by heart, and read in a low but clear voice, and you will come from the farthest parts of the north, you and many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great multitude and a mighty army. Ezekiel 38 verse 15. On the faces of those in the cafe, a curiosity mixed with fear could be read. Some tried to smile, but their smiles were crooked. Others were watching the television, as if they wanted to compare the old man's words with the images on the screen. And what did they see? Columns of armored vehicles, convoys of trucks, thousands of soldiers in uniform, the iron horses that Abraham would later talk about. I was skeptical at the time, but something in his tone made me unable to dismiss everything. He didn't speak like a fanatical preacher, but like a witness who had seen too much. A few days later, I had my first serious conversation with him, outside, on the bench in front of the store. The sky was leaden, and the wind carried the smell of burnt smoke from several kilometers away. Abraham looked at the road and said, "In the scripture, there are not just stories, but warnings. Ezekiel saw how entire nations gather against a small country, without walls. And that war is not just between people, it is the beginning of the end." "And you think now?" I asked. He smiled sadly. "I don't think so. I know." He told me then about the prophecies that described a massive attack, with armies from the north, supported by others from the east, marching towards a final battle. He said that the biblical geography, if you read it carefully, matched the troop movements I was seeing on the news. "You don't have to believe what I say," he would say, "just look at the map and see what lines up." But Abraham was not just a man of the scriptures, he was also an observer of people. He said that wars don't just start with weapons, but with hearts that are at odds. When hatred crosses borders into words, weapons just follow, he would tell me, tapping the ground with his cane as global tension grew. The old man became more and more present in the village. He would come to the cafe, to the store, to the well, and talk to anyone who would listen, read not only from Ezekiel, but also from Daniel and Zechariah, but Ezekiel 38 and 3:9 were for him the main map. You often heard him say, "And I will bring it to pass in the last days, and they will know that I am the Lord." He was not talking about a military victory of some state, but about a cosmic confrontation, in which God himself stops the war through supernatural intervention. Some avoided him, disturbed by the way he always brought up the end. But others, especially the elderly, sought him out. They asked him what he thought about certain events, if they were in the book. He answered calmly, but he never gave exact dates. "It is not our business to know the day and the hour," he would say, "but it is our business to recognize the signs." One evening, when the news was talking about a new attack on a major shipping lane, Abraham came to my house. He had never done this before. He sat down at the table and took out a bag, an old, yellowed map. It was a biblical map, with names of countries that no longer existed as such. He pointed to a point and said, "Here is the key. Here they all gather, and when they are here, there is only one battle left." I did not know then how close the moment was. But there was no fear in his voice, but the certainty of a man who knows the storm is coming, but has already found shelter. The days passed, and Abraham's words seemed less and less theory and more a chronicle of reality. New alliances appeared on the news, just as he had said. Many peoples with you, and great armies were coming from the north, as he had quoted from Ezekiel. It no longer seemed like a coincidence. When I asked him if he saw a peaceful end, he shook his head. "Not after all, it was written like that. It won't be peaceful, but for some, the end will not be fear, but a beginning." There was a light in his eyes that you couldn't explain in simple terms. It wasn't optimism, it was something deeper, as if he were looking over the edge of history and seeing what was coming after the last page. And the weeks that followed, more and more people in the village listened to him. Even those who had laughed at first now fell silent as he began to speak. And every time, Abraham concluded the same way. When the shadows gather, you have to know where to look, not at the darkness, but at the sunrise. And so, slowly, old Abraham became not just a village man, but a kind of watchman, a guardian of the ancient words that, somehow, seemed to come to life before our eyes. Chapter 3. The First Steps of the Storm. A storm never begins with the loudest noise. First it is a vibration, a muffled murmur that only the attentive hear. And the early days of March, that murmur turned into a roar, and then, in one night, it hit everywhere at once. It was close to midnight when our village was awakened by a sound like we had never heard before. It was not thunder, nor an earthquake, but a series of short and rapid explosions, somewhere far away, but loud enough to make the windows vibrate. The dogs began to bark chaotically, and people came out to the gates in their pajamas, looking at the sky. Nothing was visible, only a reddish glow on the horizon. Then came the news, broadcast on international channels before our local networks realized what was happening. 3 large cities, located in different parts of the world, had been attacked simultaneously. Airstrikes, they said, and a warning, no official declaration of war. The images were blurry, but clear enough to see towers collapsing, bridges torn away, and entire streets covered in dust. The people in the cafe watched in silence. No one was joking, no one was commenting. Old Abraham stood in a corner, his eyes fixed on the screen, but he didn't seem surprised, he seemed prepared. "Now the book opens," he said slowly, "and the pages will turn quickly." The next morning, it was learned that all three cities were strategic centers, ports, commercial hubs, command headquarters. But the biggest shock was not their destruction, but the fact that the attacks had taken place thousands of kilometers away, at the same time, almost to the second. It was clear that this was not a single regional conflict, but something coordinated on a huge scale. Rumors began to flow faster than official information. Some said that attacks on the capital would follow. Others that the internet would be completely shut down to control information, and schools. Parents came early to take their children home. The store, the shelves of water and canned goods were emptying. An unspoken question could be seen on people's faces. How long do we have until it comes to us too? That evening, Abraham came to the cafe again, but he did not sit down. He stood, leaning on his cane, and said, "No king leads his army without being convinced that the battle is decisive. And no one attacks in 3 places at once unless he wants to shake the earth. It is the beginning of the road to the Great Plain." He opened the Bible and read a verse from Ezekiel 38, about peoples coming like a storm, like a thick cloud covering the land. He did not need to explain much to us. The images on the television were the perfect illustration. Just 2 days after the first attacks, other cities fell. This time, not only because of the bombs, but also because of internal chaos. The lack of electricity, drinking water, and communications had caused people to turn against each other. Gas stations were looted, stores were devastated. Even the police could no longer maintain order. I remember the moment when, at news, the presenter said in a trembling voice, "City X no longer exists as an administrative entity." It no longer existed. It disappeared in less than 48 hours, not under water, not under an earthquake, but under its own collapse. Another night, I climbed the hill near the village to look at the sky. Usually, there you would see stars and silence. Instead, I saw streaks of light crossing the horizon, some orange, some blue, followed by explosions in the distance. The noise arrived with a delay, like a dark echo. The wind brought the smell of dust and burning gasoline. On the way back, I met Abraham. He was leaning against a tree, looking at the horizon. "The storm has passed," he said, "and when the storm passes, it does not stop except at the command of the one who called it." The next morning, the village was awakened by the sound of heavy engines. Military convoy was passing along the main road. Covered trucks, armored vehicles, tanks. The soldiers weren't looking at us, but you could tell they were tense. A child raised his hand to greet us, and a soldier gave him a short, almost mechanical nod. It was a strange sight. The silence of the village broken by tracks and steel. In the days that followed, the virtual front of the news and the real front of the battles drew ever closer. The attacks no longer targeted only military infrastructure, but entire cities. One of them, just a few hundred kilometers away, was hit with such intensity that, in the images, it seemed to have melted. Streets that had been bustling with life were now canyons of rubble. As night fell, the sky was never completely dark. The light from fires dozens of kilometers away reflected in the clouds, creating a red glow, almost like a sunset that never set. Finish. Some said they would never see a beautiful sunset again without being reminded of it. With these events, the speech of world leaders became increasingly harsh. The words, peace and negotiation, had disappeared, and their place, total victory, decisive operation, complete defeat of the enemy, appeared. It was clear that each side saw the fight as the last chance to impose its order. One night, Avram invited me to his house. He lived on the outskirts of the village, in a small, single-story house. He invited me to a table on which his old map was spread out again. "See," he said, pointing with his cane to several regions. "All roads lead here. And when they get here, there will be no turning back." "And how far is it from there?" I asked. "Not much. The storm does not take small steps." He told me how each event of the last few days corresponded to a sequence of prophecies he had read his whole life. He did not seem happy that he was right. He seemed rather burdened. The next morning, the village received the news that a town less than 100 kilometers away had been completely evacuated during the night. Tens of thousands of people moved in a hurry. It was not known where they would be taken. On the side roads, we began to see small groups of refugees, women with children, men carrying heavy backpacks, tired faces, lost eyes. Some were from areas where there was nothing left. Others had just fled before the nothing reached them. To lunch, in the cafe, someone asked, "I wonder what's next." Abraham, without looking up from his tea, replied, "What is written? And what is written does not change. That was the night when I understood that the first steps of the storm were not a simple prelude. It was already the beginning of the final march. Chapter 4. Reddish Sunrise. That morning, I knew something had changed before I even opened my eyes. The air in the room had a strange smell, like wet iron mixed with stale smoke. When I stepped outside, I immediately felt that the light was not normal. It was not the pale light of winter mornings, nor the warm light of early summers. It was a diffuse, reddish glow that seemed to come not from just one point on the horizon, but from everywhere. The sun was rising through a thick layer of gray clouds, and its disk was not yellow nor white, but a dark red, like coagulated blood. You could look at it directly, without burning your eyes, but the look didn't calm you, it made you even more anxious. It was as if it wasn't our sun, but another star, cold and hostile. The people in the village had come out to the gates, each with the same gesture, eyes narrowed towards the sky, hand raised to shade their foreheads. No one said anything. Even the dogs stood still, with their ears raised, as if they sensed that this sunrise wasn't just light, but a sign. Old Abraham also appeared. Leaning on his stick, he looked at the sun without blinking. As it says, he murmured, the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood, before the day of the Lord come. Only now we see the sunrise in blood. Means that time is hastening. No one asked what book he was quoting from. Those who knew him knew that such words came from the scriptures, but they seemed more vivid than ever. Noon, the sky had not fully cleared. The clouds retained their orange and red hues, and the light gave all objects a strange color. The houses looked older and shabbier, and the people's faces looked more tired, as if time had passed over them in a single night. When the rain began, we realized that it was no ordinary rain. The drops were heavy, almost greasy, and they left dark marks on our clothes. Within minutes, brown spots, like burns, had formed on the leaves of the trees and on the grass in the yards. The children who they had been playing outside when their parents hurriedly called them, man put a bucket under the eaves and looked at the collected water. It had a yellowish tint, with reflections of rust. Acid rain, he said, almost in a whisper, as if he were uttering a curse. It was not something we did not know existed in the world, but it was something we did not expect to see here, in our little forgotten corner, and yet, it was happening. And the fields, the alfalfa and wheat seemed to bend under the weight of the rain, but not in a natural way. The leaves were wrinkled and darkened in just a few hours, and the river, the fish were starting to float on the surface, lifeless. Abraham came back to the cafe, wet from the rain, his coat stained with brown drops, put his cane down by the table and took a small, worn Bible from his pocket. Nature responds, he said, not just people. During the flood, the waters came to cleanse. Now they come to burn. It's the same voice, just a different work. The news confirmed what I was seeing. In several areas, the rains of the last few days had caused the acidity levels in the soil and water to increase. It was said to be because of the smoke and ash from the bombed cities, carried by the winds over great distances. The images showed entire trees withered in a single night, dead birds gathered on the shores of lakes, and people covering their faces with wet scarves to be able to breathe. One night, I woke up terribly thirsty and went outside to get water from the barrel in the yard. The water had a strange, metallic smell. I took it into the house, but I couldn't drink it. I thought of the cities that no longer had any water, and I realized how quickly we could find ourselves in the same situation. As the days passed, the sunrises became more and more gloomy. The sun no longer appeared as a clear disk, but as a diffuse spot, hidden by layers of smoke and clouds. Its color changed from dark red to dirty orange, but never to the clear yellow that I knew. It was as if the sky had lost its health. And the people began to change with it and the village. Discussions about the war were increasingly rare, not because it did not exist, but because it seemed superfluous to talk about it anymore. We all felt that the war was no longer just between armies. It was something bigger, an imbalance that had encompassed everything, from the atmosphere to the last drop of water. Avram said that this was the beginning of the pains. Just as a woman feels the first contractions and knows that she can no longer stop what is coming, so it is now. Nature feels before us. She does not lie to herself with false hopes. One afternoon, when the sky seemed heavier than ever, a strong wind came from the north. It brought with it a fine, whitish dust that settled on everything it touched. It stung the skin to the touch. Within a few hours, the village garden seemed covered in a poisonous frost. The children were kept in their homes, and the animals were locked in their stables. In that oppressive silence, I began to hear a new sound. The raindrops hitting the roof made a kind of corrosive rustle, as if they were gnawing at the metal. I thought about how long our houses, our roofs, our cars, everything we had built, would last, if the sky continued to pour this kind of water. On the 5th day of reddish sunrise, Avram called me to go up the hill, to see what the world looked like from above. We climbed in silence, and when we arrived, I was speechless. The horizon no longer had clear boundaries. Everything was blurred, as if someone had painted the earth with a dirty brush, and the distance, fires were still smoldering, sending columns of smoke into the sky. The sun, already halfway to noon, seemed tired, as if it was barely making its way through the shadows. "See," said Abraham, "it is not only humans who are at war. The sky, the earth, the waters, all have aligned themselves to the same call. And when all these move together, no one can stop them. On the way back, I felt the first drops of a new rain. I covered my head with my coat, but brown marks remained on my hands. I knew then that this reddish sunrise was not an isolated event. It was the new normal, and that, before it truly dawned, the darkness would deepen." Chapter 5. The Iron Horses. The wind blew from the north that day, cold and heavy, bringing with it a sound that no one had ever heard in these parts before. First, it seemed a distant murmur, like the roar of an invisible waterfall, but as the hours passed, the sound grew, thickening into a repetitive thud, like a huge heart beating somewhere underground. Abraham sat on the bench in front of the house and listened. "It's not thunder," he said, "and no earthquake. It's iron horses." I didn't rush to contradict him, and recent weeks, many of his words had come true. He raised his cane and pointed to the horizon, where the sky was darkening not because of clouds, but because of smoke rising from the ground. By noon, I could see the first silhouettes. They weren't real horses, but endless rows of armored vehicles, troop carriers, tanks, and trucks. Their dark green or gray paint was already covered in reddish dust. They moved in perfect order, with a precision that seemed unearthly, like a giant creature made of thousands of segments. Along every major road that came from the north, the same metal column flowed. From the east, another column, just as dense, was approaching from above. If you looked, someone would have seen the earth squeezed between two iron jaws. The sound of the engines was harsh, continuous, without pauses. You felt it in your chest, in your bones, like a constant vibration. The ground beneath your feet trembled slightly, and the windows of the houses vibrated with each passage of the heavy tanks. The animals were restless. The dogs barked without stopping, the cows mooed, and the birds had disappeared hours before. In front of the convoy, special trucks carried artillery pieces as long as our houses. Behind them, cars full of short but thick rockets could be seen, each with its tip covered by a shiny shell. Between these vehicles, soldiers in identical uniforms walked with their faces covered by black masks, like faceless figures. Abraham murmured again, as if to himself, sad face. Ezekiel 38 verse 15. "You will come from the depths of the north, you and many peoples together with you, all on horseback, a great multitude and a mighty army." Only today, the horses no longer have hooves, but tracks. When the first convoy reached the village, we realized that they were not coming in a hurry. They moved with a calculated movement, as if time did not matter. They were too confident in their strength to hurry. From time to time, they would stop for a few minutes, and then all that could be heard was the whine of idling engines and the sound of cooling metal on the road. The wheels and tracks left deep tracks, crushing the asphalt. The dust rose in clouds and settled on houses, clothes, and skin, leaving a bitter taste in the mouth. Children watched from behind the gates, and the old men stood motionless, with lost gazes, as if they were seeing a vision from another world. From the east, the second wave of iron horses, it was even more impressive. They carried flags with unknown symbols, in bright colors, red, black, and gold. Entire trucks were loaded with supplies, containers, water tanks, fuel, and ammunition. It was clear that they were not just passing through. They had come to stay. Tonight, the convoy did not stop. Their headlights formed endless rows of luminous eyes that moved slowly, and the sound of their engines filled the air like a background noise of the earth itself. From a distance, it seemed like a river of yellowish-white light that flowed uninterruptedly. One evening, I climbed onto the roof of the barn to watch from the north and east. The two streams of light were getting closer and closer to the center. The sky, the smoke of the burned cities mixed with the steam raised by the acid rain. The lights of the convoy reflected diffusely in that haze, giving everything a spectral glow. Abraham said it was not just a war of men. These are just the tools. A craftsman does not throw away his chisel. He uses it for what he has to do. Do these armies. They do not know that they are fulfilling something written thousands of years ago. And the days that followed, the first cities on their routes disappeared from the news, and no messages, no transmissions, not even satellite images. It was as if those places had been wiped off the map. Civilians fleeing from the north told of earthly thunder and rains of fire that fell from the sky before the tanks entered the city. Some spoke of weapons that made no noise but melted the concrete walls like wax. Others described soldiers walking through the smoke unaffected, with almost mechanical movements, and the fields, after their passage, nothing living remained. The grass was scorched, the trees fell, the earth black and glassy, as if it had been struck by a giant lightning bolt. The rivers through which their vehicles passed turned black within hours, and the fish died instantly. One night, as I watched from the hill, I saw how the two armies, the one from the north and the one from the east, approached each other in the distance, like two giant waves about to collide. Between them, the land seemed like an empty field, but Abraham said that there was the appointed place. Armageddon, he said softly. That valley had witnessed many battles, but none like this. The next day, the sky darkened without being night. The dust, smoke, and clouds made the day look like a prolonged twilight, and that weak light, the rows of iron horses, seemed endless. I understood then that it was not just a show of force. It was a call, a gathering for the last battle, and the air hung a heavy mixture of the smell of diesel, the smoke of burnt plastic, and a metallic, almost sweet, smell that made you nauseous. From somewhere, in the middle of the columns, a kind of rhythmic music sounded, a combination of drums and electronic sounds. There was something hypnotic about it, as if it were meant to keep the soldiers in a constant state of advance. And the village, people only left their homes for the most necessary reasons. I knew that sooner or later, these armies would pass by here too, and when it did, we had nowhere to hide. One evening, Abraham said, when it finishes its journey, there will be no place on earth where it has not passed. And then another sound will be heard, not of engines, but of a trumpet. And no one will be able to say that they did not know. I looked at the horizon again. The iron horses moved tirelessly, wheels and tracks, fire and smoke. And in their roar I began to hear something else, an ancient echo, like a warning from across the centuries. Chapter 6. The Decided Day. The sun had not risen normally for several days. Ever since the earth had begun to tremble under the tracks and wheels of the two armies, the morning light always came filtered through a veil of dust and smoke. The sky seemed painted a sickly yellow, and the air smelled of hot iron. That day, old Abraham did not sit on the bench in front of the house. He remained standing, his staff resting on the ground, looking out over the wide valley to the south. I knew what place that was. He called it the Decided Gate. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river, the Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way of the kings from the rising of the sun might be prepared. He spoke softly, as if he were speaking to someone unseen. I don't know if the Euphrates River was really there, but I know that something had happened in those days. The plain in the valley was dry, cracked, like an open wound in the ground, no water, no life, just a whitish soil, scorched by the sun and dusted by the footsteps of thousands of soldiers. From the north, we could already see the first lines of armored vehicles and tanks stopping on the edge of the valley. From the east, the second metallic stream stretched just as far. There were so many of them that they seemed to swallow the horizon, and yet they moved with an almost unreal discipline. Above, the sky was furrowed by black plains, with no visible signs. No, they were making unnecessary turns. They were moving forward, unloading huge packages with parachutes, probably ammunition, supplies, or weapons like I had never seen before. And the sky, beyond the noise of the engines, a strange murmur could be heard, like a breeze with a deep tone. And the village, people stopped talking to each other. Everyone was making their last preparations, but not to flee. Everyone knew that there was no longer a safe place. Some were closing their doors and windows with boards. Others were burying precious objects in the yards. A few were kneeling, praying. Avram climbed the highest hill. Nearby, I followed him. The view from there was overwhelming. Two seas of iron and fire were preparing to meet in the middle of the plain. Between them, only an empty space, but guarded by drones and isolated soldiers, like a stage before the final show. And I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are spirits of demons, performing unimaginable signs, and they go out to the kings of the entire inhabited earth, to gather them to the war of the great day of God Almighty. He continued, his voice trembling. I didn't know if he was speaking metaphorically or literally, but his words fit strangely well with what I was seeing. Next to the armored vehicles were moving bizarre machines with articulated metal legs that seemed to walk over the rough terrain. They had flashing lights and emitted a constant, disturbing humming sound. That day, at noon, something happened that I will never forget. The sky suddenly darkened, as if someone had drawn a veil over the sun. A mist descended over the valley, dense, gray, swallowing colors, and in that darkness, we began to see bright explosions, like green and blue lightning, but without the usual sound of thunder. Avram said, "It begins," and then, as an answer, an infernal noise broke the silence, thousands of engines revving at maximum speed, the rumble of caterpillars, the roar of artillery, the roar of planes diving. The ground beneath our feet vibrated so loudly that it seemed as if the entire valley was rising and falling. I saw the first artillery salvos crossing the empty space between the two armies. Each impact raised columns of earth and black smoke. In a few minutes, the empty space no longer existed. It was a field full of flames, debris, and deep craters. From the village, some people began to descend into the valley. Not with weapons, but with white flags, perhaps thinking that they would be able to negotiate or stop the slaughter. None of them turned. On the hill, Abraham did not move. He seemed to be looking beyond what we could see. Behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watcheth, and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked, and they see his shame, is said, quoting again, Revelation 16 verse 15. Then he turned to me. Remember, this is not just a battle between men. Here, earth, heaven, and souls meet for the final reckoning. And, indeed, in the hours that followed, everything took on a nightmarish dimension. In addition to the constant noise of war, other sounds were heard, metallic screams, like broken iron, long, vibrating groans, which I could not attribute to any known weapon. A blinding flash of lightning lit up the plain, followed by a white explosion that left a perfectly round hole in the ground, as if someone had taken out a piece of the world with his hand. From there, instead of smoke, rose a thick steam, smelling of sulfur and blood. I felt the air becoming heavy, hard to breathe. A reddish fog settled over the field, enveloping the soldiers and the cars. In the middle of it, red lights flickered and went out, like eyes peering out of the darkness. And then, in that almost unreal scene, Abraham did something unexpected. He stood up straight, took off his hat, and began to softly sing an old psalm. His voice was lost in the roar of the engines, but the words were clear to me. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? In that moment, I understood what he meant by the day of reckoning. It was not just the day when nations would show their weapons. It was the day when all life would be tested, a day of no return. As the sun went down, the natural light disappeared completely on the field. The only sources of light were the explosions, the fires, and the blinding lights of vehicles. The silhouettes of the soldiers were outlined against the flames, moving quickly, like living shadows. By sunset, the two armies were already engaged in direct contact. The tracks were crushing metal and bodies. The air was full of sparks, pieces of iron, and hot ash. It seemed that the whole earth was vibrating, not just from the battle, but from a deeper tension, as if the whole world was holding its breath. And somewhere in this chaos, I knew that there was a point where everything would be decided, a point that no one could not control it. Abraham looked at me for the last time that day and said, when they reach the center of the valley, it will not be the people who will decide the outcome. And as night fell over the field full of iron horses and flames, I felt for the first time that I was witnessing not just a war, but a final act written before I was born. Chapter 7: Fire over the Plains. The wind changed that night. Until then it had only brought the smell of burning oil, dust, and diesel fumes, but now it brought something else, a sweet, heavy smell that turned your stomach inside out, and no one had to ask me what it was. When the gray dawn took shape, I saw the smoke in the distance. It was no longer the smoke of battle, of artillery, or of burning tanks. It was a thick black smoke, rising from a compact mass, like a giant tower breaking in the wind. The city was burning. It was not a village of a few houses. It was a metropolis of over 1 million souls, set between fertile fields and calm waters. A month ago, its streets were full of children playing, crowded markets, tall buildings sparkling in the sun. Now, of all that was alive, only the echo of the flames remained. I climbed to the hill from which, in good times, you could see the city in all its glory. Now, the panorama was a silent inferno, because from that distance, the flames could not be heard. They could only be seen dancing, like orange and red tongues, intertwined with the smoke that rose to the sky. Old Abraham was next to me. He held the Bible tightly in his hand, as if he could stop the fire just by touching the pages, and then, in a low voice, he began to quote, "All the host of heaven perish, the heavens are rolled up like a scroll, and all their host fall like a leaf from the vine, like a falling fig leaf from the tree." Isaiah 34 verse 4. I looked up at the sky. The smoke covered the sun, and the light only filtered through reddish cracks, like a bloody sunrise, and places, lightning cut through the clouds, but without rain, only illuminating even more. The silhouettes of the burning buildings were very clear. Abraham continued, without taking his eyes off the city. "For the Lord is angry with all the nations, and full of wrath against all their armies, to utterly destroy them, to utterly destroy them." Isaiah 34 verse 2. In a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, I saw something that remained etched in my memory. A river of people tried to flee to the fields, but above them were rolling small, black drones, releasing charges that ignited the surrounding grass. The fire was pushing them back toward the city, toward smoke and flames. I went down the hillside a little to get a better look. And I noticed how the fire was not just spreading naturally, carried by the wind. It had a direction, a rhythm, as if someone was directing it, pushing it from side to side, like an invisible army. And at the intersection, a fuel tank exploded, sending up a fireball that engulfed 3 buildings at once. Windows shattered with a loud crack, and molten glass began to flow down the walls, mingling with the hot metal. Abraham said quietly, "The buffaloes will fall with them, and the oxen with the bulls. Their land will be soaked with blood, and the dust will be filled with fat." Isaiah 34 verse 7. I don't think he was speaking metaphorically. And those streets, blood literally flowed down the slopes, mixing with the water from the broken pipes. The fields on the outskirts were already blackened, the meadows were smoldering, and the sky had descended upon us, drowning everything in smoke. As the day wore on, the wind carried the sounds to us, a continuous roar of wood cracking, metal hissing, glass shattering. Every now and then, explosions would sound, small ones, probably from compressed gases or from vehicles catching fire, and among all this, a strange sound, a kind of long wail, that seemed to come from the ground, not from the people. As if the city itself was crying. A group of soldiers appeared from the north, coming towards our position. They were covered in dust and soot, their faces burned by the heat. One of them stopped next to Avram and said to him, "There is nothing left to save there. The order is to leave nothing standing." Avram did not answer. He just looked at him with a sadness that could have cut anyone's heart. The soldier turned his head and left. Sunset. The flames had become even stronger. The air was so heavy with smoke that even the birds were falling from their flight, lifeless, onto the field. The sunlight was filtered in a strange orange, making everything look like an old, yellowed photograph. In a moment, the wind changed direction, and I felt the heat of the flames even at our distance. The skin on my face instantly dried out, and my breathing became painful. I thought that if the fire continued for another day, everything within a radius of tens of kilometers would be just ashes. Abraham closed the Bible, but not for long. He said, almost whispering, "This is just the beginning." And I knew he was right. That city was only the first stone to fall in an unstoppable chain of events. When night fell over the plain, the city was still burning. The flames lit up the smoke clouds from within, like a kind of reverse twilight, a sunrise that brought not life but death. From a distance, the fire looked beautiful, but you knew that that beauty was fueled by everything that had ever been alive there. We stayed on the hill until late, watching the sky light up and go out. The bigger explosions were followed by hours of smoldering fire. Before we left, Abraham spoke the last verse from Isaiah 34 verse 10 that I ever heard from his mouth. "It shall not be quenched day nor night, and its smoke shall ascend forever. It shall be desolate forever and ever, and none shall pass through it forever and ever." We descended the hill without looking back. Not because we didn't want to, but because we knew that image would haunt us, and with eyes closed. Chapter 8. The Dying Waters. After the fire, there was silence, not a good silence, but a heavy, oppressive one, in which the air seemed charged with an unseen fear. The smoke had partially cleared, but what remained behind it was more sinister than the flames themselves. Dawn. I walked towards the river. I had known it since I was a child. It flowed wide and clear, nourishing the meadows and orchards around. In the summers of old, you would see people bathing, children running along the banks, fishermen with their rods ready. Now, the first thing I smelled was the smell. It was not the smell of mud or fish, but a chemical metallic stench that dried your throat and made you dizzy. When I got closer, I understood why. The water was no longer blue or green. It was murky, with a glossy film of oils and substances, unknown fish floating on the surface. The first dead fish appeared close to the shore, gray bodies, with swollen bellies and glassy eyes. Then, as we went downstream, I saw hundreds, perhaps thousands, floating together. The waves were gathering them into the corners of the banks, forming macabre heaps. Abraham was beside me. He was breathing slowly, as if each breath might be his last. He said, "The name of the star was Wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the waters, because they were made bitter." Revelation 8 verse 11. I looked at the river again. It had a kind of evil sheen to it, as if it were absorbing the light and returning it in a sickly glow. As we approached a small village on the bank, I saw people gathering water in jars, desperate. It didn't seem they didn't care about the smell or the color. Thirst was stronger than reason. A woman with a sunburned face approached us and asked, "Do you have any filters?" "My children can't wait any longer." Abraham nodded. His eyes filled with tears, but he offered no lies, no false hope. The woman staggered away, lost in the crowd on the shore. Out at sea, we saw the remains of an overturned boat. Around it, floating among the corpses of fish, were a few human bodies. They seemed asleep, if it weren't for their pale, almost white skin, and the lack of any movement. Around noon, we reached the lake. What I saw there I don't think I'll ever be able to fully describe. The lake, once clear and deep, now looked like a broken mirror. The film of chemicals had formed iridescent patterns, with colors strange, phosphorescent green, purple and black. When the wind blew, the film moved in slow waves, like a living being on the shore. A few dead cows lay lying, their legs unnaturally crossed. Birds that had tried to drink water were scattered around, wings outstretched, eyes bleary. Abraham spoke softly. For the land is defiled by its inhabitants, who have transgressed the laws, have not kept the commandments, and have broken the everlasting covenant. Isaiah 24 verse 5. A cold wind swept over the lake, bringing with it a fine, almost invisible steam. I felt it touch my face, and it gave me a burning sensation, like a thin cut. I instinctively took a step back, to the edge of the village by the lake. I found a well. Its water was clearer than that of the river, but when I held the bucket up to the light, I saw little black specks floating in it, like strange larvae, and no one knew what they were, but everyone knew that it was not good to drink them. The next day, the news in the village talked about people dying overnight after drinking water from there. The symptoms were terrible: sudden fever, spasms, eyes turning blood red, then a final silence. We didn't need to be told that we couldn't drink those waters anymore. But where to go? The lakes, the rivers, the wells, they were all the same. There was no place to find clean water. One evening, I met a group of refugees who said that the seas had changed too. The salt water had become denser, with a gray foam on the surface, and the fish had completely disappeared. The ships that still dared to go out fishing were returning empty, with sick sailors. Abraham, looking into the distance, said, "When the water dies, life dies. And people will only understand when it is too late." And the following days, I saw how the lack of water changed everything. People were no longer looking for food, but for water. They fought each other for a few drops, paying with jewelry, weapons, even their lives. One morning, a man came to Abraham with a small, sealed bottle. He said it was clean water, kept from a source safe. He asked us for an old watch that Abraham was wearing in return. Abraham gave him the watch without hesitation. When I opened the bottle, the smell hit me immediately. It was river water, only slightly filtered. The man had already disappeared. I didn't drink it. I poured it on the ground. And I saw how, in a few seconds, the ground began to smoke slightly where the liquid had fallen. Tea was clear. The waters were no longer ours. They were someone else's now, or maybe they had simply died. One night, I dreamed that the river, lake, and sea were rising against the people, and the waves were black, with shining eyes, and they were swallowing entire villages. I woke up sweating, but when I went outside, I saw that the dream was not far from reality. The lake had receded overnight, but its edges were covered with a black foam that seemed to move on its own. Abraham, regarding the phenomenon, said only this: "It's not just about poisoning, it's a judgment." And then I knew that if the fire in the burned city had been the beginning, the death of the waters was the inevitable continuation. The waters no longer sang, no longer flowed, no longer brought life. They whispered now, in a language I didn't understand, but which said the same thing: the end is approaching. Chapter 9. The Fifth Trumpet. It was the third day since I had seen the lakes die. The sun had risen weakly, like a rusty coin, no longer warming. The air smelled of metal dust and old smoke. I thought nothing could be worse than the death of the waters, but then I heard it. First it was a low, barely perceptible sound, like a murmur of the earth. I thought it was the wind, but then it grew, turned into a deep, heavy roar, like a chorus of thousands of voices thundering together. Those around me stopped, looked up, and fell silent. Far away from the east came a cloud. It was no ordinary cloud. It was an intense black color, but not like the smoke of burning wood, but like a solid material that moved, struggled, pulsated in the weak morning light. The cloud seemed to absorb everything its rays touched. Abraham closed his eyes and spoke slowly but clearly. The fifth angel sounded his trumpet, and I saw a star fall from heaven to the earth, and he was given the key to the bottomless pit, and he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke rose from the pit like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the pit. Revelation 9 verses 1-2. As the cloud approached, I realized that it was not just smoke. It was made up of millions of moving dots, like tiny insects or birds, that were piled on top of each other, forming dark waves. In the middle of them, sparks of light could be seen, not white, but reddish, like embers hidden under ashes. The sound grew. It was no longer just a roar. There were cries, vibrations, and a kind of crackling that went into your bones. I felt the ground vibrate beneath my feet, as if something huge was approaching from below. People started running, but to what? The cloud was coming everywhere, and in a few minutes, the sky was no longer visible. The day turned into complete night, but not an ordinary night. The light had disappeared completely, and the air was thick with an invisible matter that took your breath away. Then the real roar began. It was like a giant horn, mixed with thousands of screaming voices. I covered my ears, but the sound penetrated through flesh, through blood, directly into the mind. People fell to their knees, screaming, tearing off their clothes. Creatures began to descend from the cloud. At first I thought they were giant locusts, but they had strange shapes, black, shiny bodies, wings that vibrated with impossible speed, and long, segmented tails with sharp tips. Their faces had something human, but twisted into a cruel, merciless expression. Abraham fell to his knees and cried out, And it was given unto them not to kill them, but to torment them 5 months. And their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when it stings a man. Revelation 9 verse 5. The first creature touched a man who was running. He fell instantly, clutching his arm, screaming in pain indescribable. Then a thin white smoke rose from his body, and he lay there trembling. It was not death. It was something worse. The victims remained alive, but their bodies were paralyzed, their eyes wide open, filled with terror. Saw a woman crawling on the ground, with spasmodic movements, as the creatures passed by her, looking for other targets. The cloud stretched for miles. The day seemed never to come again. Not a bird's song, not a human sound remained in the except for the roar of the trumpet and the buzz of black wings. We tried to run for cover, but Abraham stopped abruptly. He grabbed my arm and said, "Don't move. If you move, I'll see you. If you stay, I might pass by." We stood there, motionless, our backs pressed against a cold wall as the shadows covered us. One of the creatures came so close that I saw a reddish light pulsating in its eyes, like a microscopic heart. It passed on, and the air it left behind was hot and heavy, like the breath of a giant animal. In the distance, a flash of lightning lit up the cloud, revealing that above it was not sky but something like an open pit, a dark void that seemed to absorb every trace of light. I wondered if I could see the entrance to the abyss. Abraham whispered, his voice almost lost. Angel of the abyss, Abaddon, Apollyon, and I knew the names were not just metaphors. Hours passed, but they seemed like years. The creatures did not tire, and the roar did not abate. The darkness had become total, directionless, timeless. I wondered if the sun would ever rise again. Then, suddenly, the trumpet died out. Not completely, but like an echo that slowly recedes. The cloud began to move further, but leaving behind a dirty gray sky, without a sun. The air was still heavy, and the smell of burning and dust remained everywhere. On the ground, people lay sprawled, some moving slowly, others still, but alive. I knew their pain would not stop soon. Abraham stood up, trembling, and said, "Woe to those who dwell on the earth, because of the other trumpet blasts." I looked at him, and for the first time I felt not only fear, but also the despair of a truth that you could no longer stop. If this was only the 5th blast, what would the 6th bring? In the distance, the cloud was still visible, like a wound in the sky, reminding us that it had not gone away completely, but had only retreated for a while, and I understood that this was not the end, this was only the beginning of the torment. Chapter 10. The Dry Road. We were still under the shadow of the 5th trumpet, with the memory of the cloud of darkness that still followed us in our dreams, when Abraham called us all into a deep valley. There seemed to be a change in the air, not a relief, but a deceptive stillness, as before an earthquake. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is what is written. The 6th angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, that the way of the kings who come from the east might be prepared." Revelation 16 verse 12. I didn't immediately understand why it was important. But 3 days later, the news came. The Euphrates, the river that had fed empires for thousands of years, had begun to dry up. I hurried north, traveling through the fields, deserted and empty villages. As we drew nearer, the air grew drier, with a salty smell, as if stagnant water had evaporated. When we reached the banks of the Euphrates, I was speechless. Where once a giant serpent of water had flowed, there was now a deep scar in the ground. The wet sand cracked under the pale sun, and in places only isolated pools remained, in which dead fish floated with their white bellies up. The once smooth banks were now steep and bare, exposing the roots of trees. Abraham knelt on the bank and scooped up a handful of damp earth. He squeezed it between his fingers, and it crumbled into dust. "The water is withheld," he said, "not by ordinary drought, but by the hand of the one who prepares the way." And then I understood. The road on. The path left by the river was not just a dry path. It was a wide, straight corridor along which entire armies could move. That night I stayed on the bank. Far away, to the east, the sky had a constant reddish light, like a horizon lit by an unseen fire, and from that direction I heard something, a dull rhythm, like the beating of giant drums, sparse at first, then faster and faster, in the morning. The first movements were seen on the horizon. Black, compact formations, advancing. They were not black only. From a distance, they seemed carried by a shadow of their own. The weak sun never illuminated them completely. I saw strange flags, dark red and gold, with symbols I did not recognize, but which seemed alive in the wind. Behind them, a sea of people, many wearing dark armor, others mechanized suits, like some metallic shining exoskeletons. And they weren't just people and the vanguard, there were massive vehicles, with huge wheels and armored bodies, advancing without engine noise, as if they were pushed by an invisible force. Behind, metallic monsters in the shapes of animals, lions, dragons, horses, advanced slowly, with luminous eyes and steaming breath. Abraham pulled us aside. These are the kings of the East. Their paths were blocked by the great waters. Now they are freed, and no human power will stop them. As they advanced, there was a vibration in the air, not like an ordinary noise, but like an energy field that made the skin tingle. Each of their steps left deep marks in the dry earth of the riverbed. When I looked closer, I saw that they didn't even stop to set up camp. They advanced uninterrupted, as if their time was short and the target was very close. In a moment, the wind changed direction, and I smelled a heavy smell, a mixture of blood, metal, and something sweet, like spoiled honey. It was the smell of their army. That night, the stars were not visible at all. The sky was covered by a layer of red clouds, which seemed to be lit from within. On the horizon, the light was getting stronger, and the dull beat of the drums was getting clearer. Abraham said then, with his gaze fixed on the east, "They will cross the dry riverbed as on a road prepared in advance. And when they arrive, they will gather together the kings of the world in the place called, in Hebrew, Armageddon." His words fell on us like a sentence. We knew that there was no way back. Around midnight, we saw the first units passing by the place where we were. They walked in silence, with their eyes ahead, without looking at the banks. Behind them, the sand rose in waves, like a low mist. As they passed, the earth trembled as if from a slight earthquake. Behind them came endless columns. Some had their faces covered with metal masks, with animal shapes. Others wore tall helmets, adorned with red feathers. Many did not look like people at all, but pale-skinned beings, with eyes shining in the darkness. I saw no children, no women, no old people, only fighters. The next morning, the white of the Euphrates was full of tracks. There was no water left. The road was now wide and clear, a perfect corridor to the west. Abraham looked out into the distance and said, almost to himself, "When God opens the way, no one can close it. And when he commands war, no one can stop it." And I knew that the march would not stop until the earth was bathed again, not with water, but with blood. Chapter 11. Cities like mouths of fire. Once the kings of the East set foot on the dry road of the Euphrates, darkness began to pour over the world. The sky darkened, not with the usual storm clouds, but with a dense and palpable shadow that seemed to absorb the sunlight. As the armies advanced, the cities along their route witnessed a terrible transformation. The first capital we saw from afar seemed a fortress of glass and metal, but as we approached, we understood that it had been only an illusion. The buildings glittered in the red light of the sunset like burning eyes, ready to spit fire. Suddenly, thick smoke rose from the center of the city, and a strange roar, like a collective howl of stone and concrete, began to resound. Abraham remained silent for a few moments, then said, I said they would come. Now you see what their passage means. The cities are nothing but mouths of fire, ready to devour everything." We stepped closer and noticed details that made our stomachs clench. The streets, once full of life, were deserted, but not with the usual silence of abandoned cities. Here, the silence was charged with a strange tension, as if the walls were breathing. The windows were broken or burning slightly, and the red sunlight reflected in the cracked glass, transforming the city into an inferno of lights and shadows. As we approached, we saw the first people who had survived, a few lost, kneeling in the streets, their eyes full of fear and helplessness. Some held children tightly in their arms, others carried open wounds, and others seemed paralyzed with horror, as if there was no way out. From the center in the city, the large buildings began to emit sparks, like urban volcanoes. The streets were narrow, but flames were pouring everywhere, like fiery serpents. Abraham said, "Look, the fire was not started by human hands. The city itself has become a weapon. Everything that was proudly built is turning against those who built it." I didn't fully understand what he meant until we got close to the central square. There, the tallest building, a glass skyscraper, collapsed under its own weight. The molten metal and falling glass created a huge cloud of smoke and flames that spread rapidly around. In just a few minutes, The entire neighborhood seemed a mass of fire and ash, with shadows dancing on the walls like thirsty ghosts. That moment, I heard for the first time the screams of the surviving people. They were not the screams of ordinary fear. They were sounds that seemed to vibrate in the ground, in the walls, in the air, echoes of despair that multiplied supernaturally. The streets were filled with wounded and fleeing people, but the roads were blocked by strange machines, armored vehicles, and metallic creatures that the kings of the East had brought with them. Abraham pulled us all to the edge of a side street, away from the fire and noise, and murmured, "This is the first stage, but not the last city to fall." I saw in my vision how all the capitals of the world would become like this, each swallowing up everything that meant civilization. And then I heard something even more terrifying. The sky above the city cracked, not physically, but visually, like a thin canvas of reality torn. Dense shadows began to descend from the crack, covering the street like a wave. The shadows had no clear shape. They seemed to be the very essence of darkness, swallowing up all color and light. Those who were in their midst screamed and disappeared without a trace, as if the world had instantly forgotten them. We began to walk among the smoking blocks, each step bringing us closer to the center of the devastation. The people who still remained were either in shock or desperately trying to climb over the debris to escape. But there were no safe routes. Fire poured like lava through the streets, and the fallen blocks formed labyrinths that seemed to move by themselves, pushing people towards traps. Abraham raised his hands to the sky and said, in a trembling voice, "It is as Isaiah said, for the sword of the Lord will be blazing, and the cities will burn like torches. Everything you thought was stable, everything you thought was protected, now becomes a weapon and condemnation." In a corner of the central square, we saw a scene that shook us all. A group of soldiers were trying to save civilians, but dark shadows tore their weapons from their hands and swallowed them all. Their screams mingled with the roar of collapsing buildings, creating a concert of horror that seemed never to end. Above the city, the sky was a mixture of red and black, lit by the sparks of falling buildings and the fire that was pouring into the streets. Avram pulled us to the edge of the city and pointed to the west. This is not just destruction, T is purification and warning. Whoever thinks they can remain indifferent will be consumed just like these cities. As we left the area, we saw the last image that would haunt us forever, a collapsing skyscraper, and within the flames, the silhouettes of people were outlined, raising their hands in the air, shouting, and then disappearing in a cloud of smoke. The city became a mouth of fire, and we knew that this was only the beginning of the darkness that was to engulf the entire world. Chapter 12. The Fear of Being Forgotten. It was not death that terrified people the most in those days, but the idea that, once lost, no one would remember that they existed. Amid the ruins, among the buildings torn by flames and the dark shadows that crept silently, I understood that humanity had reached a point where fear had changed in nature. Death seemed inevitable, but oblivion was a much deeper abyss. The streets were full of people who were no longer running. Some were on their knees, holding on to the warm stones from the fires, murmuring names, short stories, fragments of memories, as if they were throwing them into the air in the hope that someone, somewhere, would catch them and keep them. I saw a mother whispering the name of her dead son at every step, repeating it desperately, lest the sound of that name should fade, lost forever. Abraham, looking at the scene, said softly, "Death can be a respite. Oblivion is total erasure, it is the second death, the one from which no one returns." In the central squares of the fallen cities, the remnants of communities gathered instinctively, not to protect themselves, but to talk. They shared stories about their homes, about the trees that bloomed in spring, about the rivers that flowed clear before the poison. T was an act of resistance against the collapse of collective memory. T was a ritual of survival of identity, even when the body had no chance. An old man, with a white beard and tearful eyes, was writing his name on a piece of metal found in the rubble. I asked him why he was doing it, and he replied, "I don't want to be just a part of the dust. If someone finds this in 100 years, maybe they will know that I was. That I saw the sky before it was dark. That I loved." Those words hit me harder than the sound of distant explosions. In the midst of the collapse, people were no longer running for food or shelter, but for a way not to be erased from the book of the world. And then I understood that the fear of oblivion was, in essence, the fear of losing the meaning of existence. Tonight, near the ruins, campfires burned weakly. They were lit not for warmth or cooking, but as a symbolic light, a silent declaration, "We are still here." Those gathered around them told stories and names of the lost, like mantras that prevented total disappearance. A child repeated the name of his dead father dozens of times, until his voice became an exhausted whisper, but he did not stop. He feared that if he stopped, the name would be carried away by the wind and forgotten. In the midst of this picture, I also saw the despair of those who they knew they had left nothing behind. Man stood alone, his gaze lost muttering, "No one will remember me, I have no children, I have written nothing, I have left nothing." In his eyes there was no longer fear of death, but an immense emptiness, as if he knew that his existence would be erased without a trace. Abraham, looking into the fire, said gravely, "This is the true fire, not the one that burns flesh, but the one that burns the names in the book of life." And somehow, that night, his words reminded me of the Apocalypse, where it speaks of those whose names are not written in the Lamb's book, and the reddish light of the flames. People's faces seemed sculpted from pure suffering. T was not just about living, but about leaving a trace, be it a word, a gesture, an object, that would pierce the darkness of the future and the days next. I saw how people began to create signs in a hurry. Symbols scratched on walls, drawings on pieces of cardboard, poems written with a trembling hand on cloths torn from clothes. All of this had no material value, but they were sparks of a silent struggle against the disappearance of memory. Some went so far as to carve their names on their own bodies, with knives or shards, to be sure that, at least until their bodies were consumed by fire or dust, someone could read who they had been. T was an extreme gesture, but full of the same desperate thirst not to be swallowed by anonymity. When another city fell, those who fled it did not just mourn the loss of their homes or loved ones. They mourned the thought that everything they had been would disappear without a trace. A woman, passing by me, thrust a half-burnt photograph into my hand and said, "Hold her, it doesn't matter if I die, but let it not be as if I never existed." I looked at her and saw in her eyes not the desire to be saved, but the silent plea to be remembered. In a world where days were measured in explosions and nights in shadows, memory had become the only way to survive spiritually. As the days passed, I understood better and better why the people of the prophecies feared the second death. For it was not just a physical end, but a complete erasure from the world's consciousness, of no longer existing in any way. The memory of a soul. And that, for many, was hell itself. One evening, Abraham gathered a few people around him and said to them, "Do not be afraid that you will die, but be afraid that you will not be forgotten by the one who wrote the beginning. For if he remembers you, neither fire nor shadow can erase you." His words brought a strange silence over the group. For a few moments, I saw how the frowning faces and the cloudy eyes relaxed. But then, the sound of a collapsed building, accompanied by the screams of those trapped inside, brought back the cruel reality. Fear could not be easily banished. That night was one in which the sky did not have even a star. The shadows descended again, and the campfires were extinguished by strong winds. In the darkness, the only thing that remained were the voices, people repeating names, stories, simple words, like echoes of their existence. And then I realized that perhaps the real battle was not against armies and fire, but against oblivion. That in those days of apocalypse, the greatest victory was for your name to be spoken once more after you were no more. Chapter 13. Signs in the Sky. The sky was no longer a shelter of light. Above the world, the vault had turned into an open wound, leaking its colors to the earth. That night, the horizon did not gradually darken, but was suddenly covered by an unnatural greenish-reddish curtain, which pulsed like a giant heart. At first, I thought it was a rare meteorological phenomenon, perhaps the last beauty of the dying world, but that heavy silence, charged with a bitter foreboding, said something else. The air smelled of burnt iron and smoke, and the strange light seemed to transform people's faces into pale masks, pierced by long shadows. From beyond the veil of clouds, the first sparks began to fall, small, but so bright that they seemed like pieces of stars. Only they were not white. Some were green, vibrating with a cold brightness, others red, flickering like live coals. They fell silently at first, drawing oblique lines across the cloudy sky, and with each impact a short column of smoke rose in the distance. But the silence did not last. In a few moments, the rain of fire intensified, and the sky began to vibrate with a deep roar, like a giant animal waking from sleep. Each meteorite left behind a colored trail, and when it hit the ground, the explosion was not only of light, but also of a hot wind, sweeping everything around. The green meteorites seemed to bring a kind of acid rain where they hit. I saw the foliage of trees instantly blacken, and the skin of animals smoke under the touch of the viscous liquid that dripped from the fallen stones. The red ones, on the other hand, turned into explosions of pure fire, igniting everything they touched, as if each one were a fuse of hell. The earth began to roar. Houses caught fire in a matter of seconds, and would burn with an incomprehensible speed. The winds, instead of extinguishing the flames, fueled them, carrying sparks for miles, igniting the fields of dry grass, the barns, even the rivers now covered with an oily film. Abraham, who was watching from the shadow of a collapsed building, spoke. In a low but clear voice. The stars of the sky will fall to the earth, like unripe figs shaken by a strong wind. Thus it is written. His words, as if taken from the Apocalypse, made the air even heavier. Those around him heard him, but no one asked anything. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the terrible spectacle above, where the sky now seemed like an inverted sea, full of waves of light and moving shadows. Then we began to feel the direct effects. The air, it was unbreathable, full of fine ash that scratched the throat and lungs. Breaths became shorter and shorter, and the skin burned even under clothes, due to the radiant heat and neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The meteor shower struck without mercy an entire building, still intact an hour before, ignited simultaneously on all floors, as if the fire had been lit from the inside. People tried to flee, but another red meteorite struck nearby, raising a cloud of incandescent dust. Those who remained trapped in it fell immediately, without a cry, covered in a fine layer of white ash that covered their faces like a funeral mask. Beyond the cities, the plains turned into red and green mirrors, illuminating the night with an unnatural glow. Animals fled chaotically, some burning as they ran, and others collapsing into rivers that boiled from contact with green stones in the distance. A mountain range seemed to melt under a concentrated rain of red meteorites, and thick smoke rose into the sky, mixing with the poisonous clouds. Those who remained alive sought shelter underground, in cellars, tunnels, or hastily dug pits. But even there it was not safe. The noise of stones hitting the ground above was deafening, and the vibrations caused the walls to collapse. Some were buried alive, not by the fire, but by their own attempt to save themselves. As the hours passed, I noticed a frightening phenomenon. The colors of the sky began to mix, and each meteorite that fell left behind a dense, almost metallic smoke that did not dissipate. The sunlight, already hidden by thick clouds, became diffuse and sickly. Abraham said again, "The signs have been given. The fire from the sky is the beginning of the end." I asked him if there was any escape, but he did not answer me. He only looked up at the rain of fire and remained motionless, as if he were waiting for something in particular. Around midnight, the meteorite rain turned into an uninterrupted torrent. There was no longer room to count the explosions. The entire earth seemed to be gripped by an incandescent fever. I saw how a river, once clear, caught fire on the surface after a green meteorite sank into it, releasing a substance that ignited instantly in contact with the air. The fires could no longer be controlled. Not even the wet ground could stop them, because the fire seemed to feed not only on combustible materials, but on the air itself. The winds carried the sparks for tens of kilometers, igniting places where no meteorite had fallen directly. By dawn, the horizon no longer existed. Everything was covered by a curtain of smoke and flames, and the sky seemed to merge with the earth. The cold green of some and the burning red of others mixed in a chaotic dance, like a war of fire against fire. That morning, the sunlight failed to pierce the poisoned sky. It seemed that we lived under a dome of rusty metal, and the earth, burned and cracked, breathed smoke through every crack. Those who remained alive were no longer happy to have survived. They knew that what was coming now could be even worse than fire from heaven. And somewhere, among the distant explosions, Abraham's voice could still be heard, repeating the same words. And the stars fell to the earth. But then they were no longer just words from Scripture. It was the realization of a reality that swallowed us whole. Chapter 14. The Gathering in the Desert. The wind carried over the scorched plain a black sand, mixed with fine ash, left from the fires that had not been extinguished for days. The sun, covered by a thick haze, seemed a pale disk, powerless, hanging above the lifeless world. The earth creaked underfoot, cracked like old leather. Not a bird was heard, not a murmur of water. Only the continuous hiss of the wind, like a tired breath of the desert. In that desolation, among hills of scorched earth and carbonized tree trunks, the first survivors gathered. There were few people, maybe 15 people, all with faces furrowed with dust and eyes sunken in their sockets. Some came from cities hit by meteorites, others had escaped from villages consumed by fire. Not one of them had clothes clean or abundant food. What had brought them together, however, was not the need for food, but the need for words. They chose a sheltered spot between two large rocks, where the wind blew less, and formed a circle. In the middle of them, on a worn blanket, someone placed an old Bible, its pages yellowed and its covers worn by time. It was the only book left between them. An elderly, thin man with a matted white beard knelt beside It. It was not Abraham, but it seemed that he knew the words, because when he opened the Bible, his hands trembled like those of a priest in a long-lost temple. We will read from Ezekiel chapter 38, he said in a low but clear voice, where the Lord speaks of the nations gathered for war. The people fell silent. Even the children who were crying from hunger and thirst were quiet for a moment. In the wilderness, every word echoed. The old man began to read, "Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and I will bring you out with all your army. As he read, each one felt how the text was no longer just ancient history, but the account of what they had experienced with their own eyes, the broken alliances, the armies coming from the north and east, the rain of fire from heaven, were all there, between the pages of the book. A young woman, with tired eyes, asked, "Do you think we are the ones left to see the end?" The old man closed his Bible for a moment and looked around. "I don't know, daughter. Maybe we are the ones left to confess." Then one of the younger men, with a wound on his forehead, added, "In my city, before the meteorite fell, someone shouted that God was calling us to repentance. No one listened to him. Now all I hear is the wind." His words floated in the small circle, heavy as stones. Each felt that his story was similar. Ignored warnings, running into the darkness, losing loved ones. As the sun set, the desert took on strange hues. The sky turned reddish on the horizon, reminiscent of the nights when fire had come down from heaven. The wind brought from afar a faint smell of smoke, as a reminder of a catastrophe. Then the old man read from Revelation 16:16. The evil spirits gathered them together in the place that in Hebrew is Armageddon is called. Some wept. It was not fear of what was to come, but the realization that perhaps that very wilderness, that circle of lost people, was a prelude to that final gathering. Then they sang, in weak voices, an old song. A song had not been heard in the wilderness for a long time, but the hoarse notes still rose to the cloud-covered sky. Each verse was more a sigh than a melody, but in that sigh there was a strange strength, the strength of those who, although surrounded by ruins, still hoped. And in the middle of the song, someone brought a dry loaf of bread, broken into small pieces and shared with everyone. No one complained about the quantity. Each piece seemed like a sacrament, a silent covenant between them that they would go on together. Night came quickly, covering the wilderness with a harsh cold. The fires were rare. They did not dare to light large ones. Flames, for fear that the light would attract strange eyes. And in the darkness, the old man opened the Bible once more and read a psalm. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Around him, people listened with their eyes closed, not to sleep, but to remember every word. Outside, the wind continued to blow, raising waves of dust. Far away, a green lightning streaked the sky, perhaps another meteorite, perhaps just the echo of a world that had not yet given up on its destruction. Thus took place the first gathering in the wilderness. They had no temples, no bells, no priests in festive clothes. They had only an old book, a small fire, and the desire not to forget who they were. In a world that was collapsing, they had found an anchor in the written word and in the silence of shared. Until morning, no one really slept. They stood leaning against each other, their gaze lost in the darkness of the desert, waiting. Most knew that it had not been the last night of fear, but for a few hours, between the verses read and the bread shared, they had felt something else, something that resembled peace. And even if the fire of heaven would return, even if the earth would open up again, that night, the desert had witnessed a rare thing. People who, in the midst of the end, chose to gather and read about the beginning. Chapter 15. The Coming King. That morning, the desert was shrouded in an unusual light. The sun, usually pale and hidden behind curtains of dust, shone faintly through a gap in the thick clouds, sending diffuse rays over the scorched hills. The air smelled of burning stone, but it was no longer the acrid smoke of days gone by. The survivors gathered among the rocks, in their makeshift camp, watched the sunrise with a kind of shyness, as if that patch of clear sky were a sign. Old Abraham stood by the almost extinguished fire, his Bible resting on his knees. His hair and beard were covered with dust, but his eyes burned with a light that came not from his body, but from a deep conviction. In recent days, he had spoken of wars, of fire, of plagues, but that morning his tone was another. "Today I will not speak to you about the fear of the end," he said quietly, as if he did not want to frighten the silence. "Today I will speak to you about the King who is coming." The people came closer. The children, weak and tired, stopped playing in the cold sand. The old men sat closer, seeking the warmth of the fire and the words. Abraham opened the book to Revelation 19:11 and began to read. "Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war." The words floated in the air, heavy and shining at the same time. Those who listened could imagine the scene, the sky tearing apart, a rider dressed in white, eyes like fire, and a name that could not be disputed. T was an image of strength, and of hope, like an anchor in a sea of darkness. When he came the first time, he came like a lamb. Abraham continued, looking up from the book, it came humbly, to bring salvation. But the second time he will come like a lion, and no one will stop him. A murmur of astonishment went through the group. For some, it was the first time they had heard this image of Christ not only as Savior but also as warrior and judge. In a world devastated by strife and betrayal, the thought of a king coming to do justice was like a breath of fresh air. Woman with red eyes from crying asked, "But how will we know that he has come? The world is full of signs and lying wonders, and of those who say, 'Behold, here he is,' or 'Behold, there he is.'" Abraham nodded, as if expecting the question. He also said, "Do not go after them. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. When he comes, everyone will know. You will not need to ask. Heaven and earth will testify to him." As he spoke, the wind began to blow gently, raising dust and making the small flame of fire tremble. It was as if the wilderness itself was listening. "Do not think that he will come to a world prepared to receive him," he added. "Scripture says that he will come in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. While some will drink and marry, others will fight and kill. But for those who watch, there will be joy." A young man, with a face lined with dirt and a hard look, asked, "And what must we do until then? How can we wait?" Abraham smiled sadly. "Let us remain pure in heart, let us keep his word, let us love one another even here in the wilderness. His kingdom begins in the heart, before it is revealed in glory." Then he opened his Bible again and read from John 14 verse 3. "And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again, and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also." These words brought tears to the eyes of many. It was not only the promise of a judge, but of a friend and brother who had forgotten none. In a world where whole families had been wiped out, the thought of someone preparing a safe place for you was more precious than any provision. Until noon, Abraham spoke of the signs of the return, of the preaching of the gospel to the ends of the earth, of cosmic commotions, of the gathering of the nations to war. But he spoke not to them as cold warnings, but as waypoints, signs that the king was approaching. Then he said something that stuck in their minds, "To all. The king does not come only to destroy evil, he comes to take back what is his. The earth was not created for death, but for life. When he comes, he will bring a new heaven and a new earth. And no one will say, 'There was a better day in the past,' because every day will be full of light." After these words, silence fell. No one dared to spoil the image of that future. Only the footsteps of the wind among the stones could be heard. A child approached Abraham and took his Bible in his hand. The old man smiled at him and stroked his dusty hair. "You will see him too, little one. You may not understand everything, but you will recognize him." As the sun went down, the sky was covered again with heavy clouds, and the morning light disappeared. But in the souls of those gathered there remained something else, a small flame, but constant, which not even the desert wind could extinguish. That night, around the small fire, they did not talk about the fear of death, nor about hunger or cold. They talked about the white horse, about the eyes like fire, about the name written on the garment. And in their minds, each one said to himself, to be ready, to be awake, not to lose sight of him. And the desert, silent and motionless, seemed to listen too, as if it knew that the king who is coming will not pass over it without bringing life.